tone, and two, it would kind of be it's one of those things where you'd have to kind of let things be, and
Mm.
then you'll hear for yourself where it then becomes something you want, right? Want to capture.
Right, because also in listening to podcasts,
Mm,
it just starts at a certain
mm,
point. And
exactly.
they've already been talking for 15 minutes, but the recording, it just sort of flows in naturally.
Exactly. And one thing about them too is that they are more edited than we'd like to believe, or that we're like shown. We're kind of shown the polished, finished product uh, that has probably been cut and spliced at certain areas, and like say if somebody hiccups or if there's a blurb or something. Um, so yeah, when I've done something, the times I've done some things like this before, I've always just encapsulated the whole thing and kind of edited as necessary. So that, because sometimes in the small talk you have some fun things that you like hearing,
Right.
uh,
You want
and
to,
sometimes there are parts of the more serious parts of the conversation where things can get repetitive, or things can bog down or slowed down in certain ways. Yeah, so
yeah,
uh,
it's something I definitely need to learn how to do with editing, and it's not my strong suit, or rather I've never really given it a try. I've never really tried
mm,
to edit and compress and
there are some softwares I could show you too at some point um, that I've used. A number of them are good, but a lot of them are like on a trial basis. But um, I'm sure there are some free ones that are also decent as well. So I think you
Yep.
would.
And also I'm sort of planning to just have the first ones not d- be unpolished, be unprofessional, just casual. And
That's
then
fair. That's fair.
as time goes on, I'm trying not to overthink this process.
Mm,
I can get nitpicky of trying to make every little thing right. And
mm.
I think this journey of social media for me too is like a allowing myself to make mistakes, allowing it to be unpolished, just putting it out there and then refining it over time, allowing myself to do it badly.
And actually, that's one thing I've seen really blow up over the past, especially couple of years, where authenticity is kind of rewarded in that way. If you could leave things in a kind of more in a rawer form.
Yeah, because a lot of it's very because there's a lot out there that's very edited and cut and superficial and little snippets of conversation taken out of context. But to see the full thing, um, a little bit more raw, I think can resonate with
Mm.
people, even the mistakes. Um, I used to I used to be really into XXX Tentacion, and he would have those like raw live streams where he just like talk to the camera. And
Mm. I
I
didn't know he
think,
did that actually. That's interesting.
yeah, he's got a lot of them. Just him talking to the camera, unedited, just sort of stream of consciousness, and that those always resonated with me. I always felt really connected to the artist in that way.
That was one thing I appreciated his music for, especially too, because that type of thing carried over. Um, like a raw sound, raw emotion, be it angry, be it sad,
Yeah.
be it happy, be it playful. Like it was one of those, yeah, like hearing him, you felt like you were accessing an unpolished cut of his. Um, and that's actually how he even came to really real fame too. It was SoundCloud rap, right? That's
Right.
the most raw form of music output that we've had
Yeah,
in
no labels, no nothing, just putting
no
it.
labels, no nothing. Like that's like just like a camera and a mic like this, like
It's interesting getting on TikTok after having not had social media since I was in high school. So I'm returning to social media after over 5 years.
Hmm.
And it's a lot of noticing that it's a lot of gimmicks. It's a lot of
Hmm.
like attention grabs and short snippets, and I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by that. Um, I mean, maybe I'm a little surprised, but
Yeah.
I I, I
Uh,
shouldn't be, but I am a little bit. And
yeah, one thing I've noticed about social media and connecting it to what we were talking about before a little bit too is people don't care what they put out for that temporary kind of gain. So you see a breakdown in discourse. Not that discourse was ever very advanced on social media in general, but I find I find the general like what's popular out of what's popular, um it's really like the um the equivalent that I think of from like pre 2008 eras. Like I don't know if you ever saw like the YouTube poop videos,
I don't know.
just like these memes that are like really like distorted and like very simplistic humor that is like crass and all of this stuff. And it's just, I don't know, it's done in such a way that it's meant, like you said, it's meant to capture attention more than it is meant to add or build in any way, in any lasting way.
Yeah, and the like long term gain, like thinking about things over long periods. I think it cuts to part of the real problem we're facing in the world at large now too, of not having the ability to think really long term and
Mhm.
really having no solutions that aren't quick fixes, easy headlines.
And one of those things that's a very common axiom of nature is if you don't use it, it'll be taken away from you. Um, so the longer that these things stay around, the less people are like thinking for themselves in a way that is publicly displayed, at least, and publicly reinforced, the less I think the public consciousness would be capable of doing that. And once the public consciousness is incapable of doing that, that's oftentimes when empires dismantle. So
Right. I mean,
we
and
see another,
we're getting there.
yeah, we may see a
Far
whole
away.
other era here in the next decade or so where, I mean, we're already, like you said, we're already kind of there a little bit where America is no longer what it was, and um, we're gonna have to hang it up because we won't be capable of keeping it up. Um, and then discourse is one small symptom that points to that core progression.
Yeah, the breakdown of communication, and that's that Old Testament story of Babel, of
Yeah.
the breakdown of the higher it goes, the more communication breaks down.
And one thing I'm finding too, which is actually very fascinating, I thought of this a couple of times over the past 8 years especially, is the fact that that even though we all speak the English language, we all hear and interpret it like in extremely different ways, which has essentially broken down into two different languages.
Mm.
Like the same way, like you have like false cognates in like different languages. Like, um, I can't think of any right now, but I know there are a lot between like French and English and German and English. Like, for example, um, in French, actuel or actuellement means current or currently, versus in English, actual or actually doesn't have to be like currently, it could be in reality.
Mm.
Even though it's the same sound, they've come to mean different things. And that's something I'm seeing in our discourse in a way that has not existed ever before.
Oh,
At
I see.
least,
So the same word meaning two very different things to two different
yeah.
people.
ringing differently to people and actually just meaning two different things.
Right.
Um, like when somebody brings up something like climate change, right? Some people automatically think hoax. Some people automatically think a theory that's overblown, versus people who think of it as like reality and like interact with it like it's reality. And they have two fundamentally different meanings.
And so
Um,
that's that creative word of God getting dismantled. Huh. I never thought of it that way. That's a really interesting point of like, or political parties too, like the word Republican means something completely different to two different people where it's almost irreconcilable.
And actually, now too, this also has to do with like historical progression and all that, but Republican before just simply meant somebody who wanted the US, or in the US context, somebody who wanted the US to be more of a republic, more ruled by elites and the like, versus the Democratic Republicans who wanted what we have now, elected representatives. Um, so even between, you have the historical axes, and then you have a kind of contemporary axis as well, where along which language is being split. And it's being split by something that is very intangible, something that we don't see or think of as tangible, at least on the level of values specifically.
I on TikTok, I was posting a video today about like the word truth and thought I'd elaborate a little bit more. It's like, so if you go like purely logically from a logician's point of view, there's an infinite number of steps to define anything as being true, so it can never be proved logically. And so
Mhm.
when you have logic taking over completely, there's no truth at all. Like when logic rules 100%, there's no truth because truth can never be firmly established. So living on faith, believing in God, it's taking something as true and then working towards it, living
Mhm.
it and thinking it. So it's like truth is something that is agreed upon on faith that we're all approaching. But if it's not agreed upon on faith, there's no truth at all because everything's subjective and nothing can be proved finally. And I think that is playing a very big role in this deterioration that we've been talking about.
Mhm. And it's so funny that you say that, because I find that to be my kind of issue when it comes to philosophy too. It's why, even though I really enjoy philosophic conversations and weighing and judging, I guess, philosophical ideas, I've never been one to actually sit down and read and study and things like that, at least in depth, because of that very problem.
Yes.
There's never any conclusion. There's never any truth in philosophy. And if there's no truth, at least on the spiritual level, if there's no truth, is it going to burden or help my journey? And I think that answers itself.
Hmm.
Um, so for me, though, it's interesting. I'm more of the opinion that it's kind of like the 3 points make a line kind of axiom that you see in math, right? For example.
What do you mean by that?
Basically, it's a kind of um, I would call it more of an axiom, because it's not necessarily like a solid thing, but it's like the assumption that if you have 3 points in any order in any direction, a line can be drawn between three of them
Like a plane?
of on a plane. Yeah, on a given plane. You have any three lines, you can draw any 3 points, you can draw a line between all three.
Right.
And that's kind of how I view truth. Whereas logic, right? You have to prove every single last point of that line, which is impossible because the line is infinite, as you're talking about. Um, so for me, when it comes to naturally, some faith has to be had because life cannot be effectively lived without it. It's like I don't know if you're familiar with The Good Place. It's the show that
I have heard the name, but I haven't watched it.
yeah, it was a show. I don't remember what network it was on. I think it was NBC, but had to do with heaven and hell. And there was one character that was a philosopher while he was alive before he passed. And one of the running gags in this show is that he very rarely was able to like come to a solid conclusion on anything because he lacked that faith, right? He had to prove every single last point on the line before the line was a line. He
Yeah,
wasn't able
like the
to,
atheists, like it's why the atheist lives in such doubt and contradiction.
yeah. Um, and the atheist is a whole other thing too, because they assume oftentimes that the material is just material, but we've been shown in many different ways that there's much more beyond what we can see, right? What we can even perceive. Science has acknowledged that vibration exists not just on the visible, not just on the electromagnetic. There's much more beyond what even our instruments are capable of picking up. Um, and actually, I'd venture to say there's an infinite amount of that spectrum that exists outside of what's visible and accessible to us. But that's a whole other conversation. And then you have things like reincarnation, which has been I hesitate to use the word proven because you know that has a very specific thing meaning to a lot of people who think academically. But there's heavy, heavy, heavy evidence there that there is a consciousness that leaves the physical, becomes imperceptible, leaves that spectrum of vibration, and re enters that spectrum of vibration that we have access to after so much time.
Right. I mean,
Hmm?
there's even allusion to that in the biblical stories
Yeah.
of
Um,
Elijah and John the Baptist.
yeah, John the Baptist. Yeah, I'm familiar with John the Baptist, but not so much with, oh, yeah, between those
Well,
are the
well,
same between.
well, I mean, there's this prophecy in the Old Testament that before the Christ comes, Elijah is supposed to come before him, and Christ says to those who can accept it, John the Baptist is Elijah.
Mm,
So, like, an incarnate, carne being flesh in Latin, incarnate in
mm,
flesh. So, um, yeah, Elijah in flesh in John the Baptist. That John the Baptist is the whatever Elijah that exists in the cosmos come down into
mm.
human form.
The same consciousness.
Right. Or
Mm,
yeah, or the same, like you were saying, that same frequency, that same something that goes down into the ether and then rises back up.
mm. The same
Again.
being, but just different gloves, so to speak.
Mm.
Um, and there's even another, well, this is a whole other thing too, but there's another incarnation before Elijah that's kind of extra Christianity, like outside of Christianity, that that I've been told about before, but um, let's leave that there for
Yeah,
now.
maybe another time.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, but something even kind of um, going by the standard of the atheist a little bit more. Um, you look at the University of Virginia, for example, they have a whole department of perceptual studies that where they've dedicated their time, where a few doctors in that division have dedicated their time to tracking down the stories of reincarnation that have happened in every culture across the world. Like there's there are very few phenomena in the world that is consistent between culture in that there it points to something, some principle or some grander truth about the world, right? Something kind of going from a very gross material or grossly, coarsely physical thing, right? To get from one platform to another, just about every civilization came up with the solution of stairs. Like stairs exist in every way, shape, or form where a civilization has built like an elevated platform and needed to get from one platform to the next. That's
Yeah,
low.
knives, bows and arrows, all these are
Very common solutions to the same problem
mm,
because they point to a grander principle about how this world works. Um,
that exists that's like as an innate possibility that becomes manifest.
mhm,
Something that's always there but hidden.
exactly. And kind of taking that a little bit further, as like an extrapolation of that same principle that you have the same solution or you have the same thing occurring around these very coarse phenomena, you can take that up to like the level of values or the level of stories and things like that, where like you have all these children that were born, right? Um, per the university, right? Most of these stories happen before the child is like 7 or so. But you have the stories of children that are able to recall down to the very numbers and letters of an address of where they lived, for example, of their previous lives. They remember those that they associated with. They remember where they worked. They remember even some of the feelings and things that they went through. They remember how they passed. And to me, it points to something leaving and coming back. Um, there's something intangible that happens when we leave. And the same way that something intangible happens when we're born in a way too, because sure, it's a bunch of cells, right? Going by a more mundane definition, the baby is a bunch of cells or whatever.
Like the
But
pre-existence of the soul or
mhm. But
the
how, yeah, the question is then how then does that baby take on a personality? How then does that baby come out with certain preferences before it's been exposed to anything? Like some babies that cry, some babies that don't. It can't be entirely environmental. But yeah, that was there's a lot more to this world than I think we give credence to, and it's something that I think about all the time.
absolutely. I mean, the mysteries of God are unsearchable.
Mhm.
They're completely unknowable. How deep this whole experience really goes, and it's like who's seen to the bottom of it? You know, who's seen to the bottom of the mind of God? Who's seen through the mind of God?
And there too is also we can only go so high in our perceptive capacity too. That's another thing. Um, it's kind of like kind of using a metaphor. It's like a peasant trying to act as a king. You know, you only get so far before the guards stop you or before you're incapable of getting there, you know.
And there's just something that came up for me was about like having to be a child to enter the kingdom of God, and where the child represents that which has not been formed yet, unformed consciousness, unformed potential, what hasn't been imprinted upon, which is closer to the divine, which is the source of all creation, and that it's uncreated, that it doesn't have the child doesn't have a very strong sense of I or self, and like sort of it hasn't grown and I mean grown and developed in the into a self, into an I, into a ego yet.
And oh, there's a lot there actually. There's a lot there. So I would then begin actually with the problem of knowledge too. Um, we lose that kind of, or we develop that kind of sense of I, sense of self, the more we come to know. And it's not that knowledge itself is a bad thing, it's what we do with that knowledge that then becomes the damage that is inflicted, that then turns itself into that continuation of the original sin. Um, we take that knowledge and we use it to form I when that knowledge is really not real knowledge, if that makes sense. Um, it's the same thing.
Going back to the choosing your own truth.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Um,
the good and evil.
choosing your own truth rather than, yeah, being more open-minded and objective about it. So for example, I think at some point actually in one of our conversations, we had spoken about, I had spoken about how limiting knowledge is. And the fact that as soon as you think you know something specifically, you eliminate the horizon of possibilities that exist.
Right, you cut yourself off from knowing more.
Exactly. As soon as you think you know something, you you cut yourself off from infinity.
Mhm.
Um, and in doing so, you deplete yourself. You're kind of your what you have access to is not enough. So I guess another way too that shows itself um, would be even through education. Um, as I think about things as happened prehistorically versus now. Sure, there are a number of advancements we've made and stuff like that. But these advancements have also brought a lot of suffering, mass suffering. And the deeper we go into these things, the shallower we get because we hang on to the shallow, we hang on to the finite in a way that is detrimental. Um, and science has become king, and it's only our knowledge that we operate out of. There's no other. There's no outside possibility outside of our framework. That's how we kind of move through the world. It's our framework, and that's it. We can be open to change and things like that, but oftentimes, at least in my interaction with others and kind of trying to understand where others are coming from, it's often been the case that they have a worldview. Sure, there may be exceptions here and there, but they don't really change or challenge it enough. And in having that worldview, you necessarily have something different than the world itself.
And I think that ties back to the becoming like a child to enter the kingdom of heaven once again.
Exactly. Exactly. Um,
Not having a specified worldview that's concrete and cut, haven't built up that little circle around you of what I know.
mhm. And all of that is based off of assumption, actually. If you break it down, um, everything that we use to determine everything that we call progress has been based on a series of assumptions on how things work.
And so what changed in you? When did that realization dawn on you? When did you start pursuing that?
Hmm. Growing up, I was very much a political science nerd. I still am to some extent. Um, and my worldview in like high school going into college was very much like, oh, the government's everything. The government makes all these decisions and rules and all of this stuff. They could very well, like I felt like governments had much more of a fixed hold on people than in reality.
Like a 1984 kind of dystopia.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, this is a side thing, but I have always felt I had a past life. Um, I had a past life in World War II Japan, but that has to do with my affinities as a child, like the things that I found myself feeling for no reason, or enjoying or liking for no reason, for no explicable reason. Um, but that's another discussion. But I think that kind of view that governments held like such a fix on how people did things and how things operated was a kind of a vestige of that previous life. But that aside too, that had lasted up till high school and in college, I realized that just about everything we do is based on assumptions and very shaky premises. So thinking about like what gives the government the right, one, what gives the government the right to do what it does. Two, does it genuinely have that much control over what happens in its country, in its own borders, or is that something that people have agreed to in thought and in agreeing to it in thought have made it that concrete? Um, it's one of those things that I started thinking about, and that it's kind of like the sweater. Once you start pulling at one idea, the rest of the sweater goes with it. It
Mm.
then extends to academia. It then extends to one's view of oneself, and also one's views of others, family, friends, things like that.
Okay, so let me like I think I know what you're getting at. Like it started out with a general paranoia about government, and then as you investigated that, sort of unraveled and um
I'd even hesitate to say paranoia because I didn't think it was a bad thing. Um, I just thought of it as like just an attribute of the world that all the governments had such strong control over the people. Um, it wasn't until college that I realized, wait, one, that can be a bad thing, and two, that's not necessarily how things are. Um, so that view was kind of unraveled, and in the unraveling of that view, I realized that I had made assumptions, and in making assumptions and realizing that those assumptions are wrong, you then begin to look for assumptions everywhere. It's like, okay, since this was an assumption and it was the basis of my thinking, where else am I wrong? And in investigating that, I read a lot of different like spiritual texts from all sorts of other traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Baha'ism, Christianity, and Judaism a little less, but Islam as well. All sorts of other traditions and approaches, and even kind of more modern movements like Theosophy, and Kankarism, all these different things that I read for to kind of continue to challenge my assumptions. Um, and I feel much freer now that I don't have any of them, or at least I assume I don't have any of them, which could be
yeah,
wrong.
I'm sure you've got one or two. I think I do as well.
Mm.
But yeah, it's constant constant awakening. And
Um,
yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to follow up a little bit with the government thing that I had similar thoughts, but for me it was more of a paranoia that everything was controlled, everything was, government, and it's sort of making the devil out to be God in a way that the malevolent forces really are in charge of everything and that there's no hope. And I mean, for me, that's where my mind would go. And it was a big step for me to realize that, God's actually the one running the show and that, even governments are but a tiny little, head of a pin in comparison to the vastness, which is the divine, the almighty.
and even that is big in comparison to the head of a pin. I get what you mean though. Um, and one element of that too is there actually that gets into all the discussion, but one thing that I find interesting out of that kind of realm of thought is the is thinking about the fact that things have been allowed to continue the way they have for so long. Um, and how lessons are and aren't learned by people in these circumstances. Um, there's a reason, and you do say that the Lord runs the show. Indeed, He does, right? You always acknowledge that's the first and that's the primary acknowledgement because it has to be so. It like follows that line, right? The three using the 3 points, but that's another discussion too. Um, but there, this going from the biblical perspective too, that this world was made and Lucifer was supposed to have like a helpful role in building this place up. Um, and he started having hubris and things like that, and that's what led to the fall, and that's what led to darkness and all of this because he thinks he knows, um, which is the beginning of a lot of darkness, the thought that you know, the idea that you know. But going a little bit further with what I was saying, it says a lot to me. It speaks volumes that we are allowed to go through this world and suffer the way we do. Um, and to me, it speaks to the development of the necessary patience, the development of the kind of dropping of assumptions, and it points to the fact that we need to earn our spot in this creation. That we really have to challenge ourselves at this point, at least. We have to challenge ourselves through and through to be able to make it to His kingdom at this point. It wasn't always the case that these things were so hard and all of that. Sure, humanity was more susceptible to disease and all of that, but um, there was less assumption that we knew on an individual basis what's going on, how the world works, and all of that, and we moved with that assumption that we don't know.
Well, and I was sort of thinking once again about relative size. So the powers of evil, the powers of darkness seem large relative to the ego. But when one comes to the realization that the true self is not the ego, then one is no longer made afraid by those dark forces that are all consuming, death, sin, greed, anger, all these things which are far too much for the ego itself. But when one begins to identify one's true self with God, with the highest being, with the true self, then the forces of evil become a lot smaller when you get to view it from a distance and
Mhm.
see.
And interesting, as you said that, I had the vision of the cosmos, so to speak, right? Um, the ego is like not even an electron. I would equate it to like a quantum particle or something of that
Right.
size, a quark, something perhaps even something even smaller than that, right? It's that small, right? And then it gets placed behind something maybe the size of, I don't know, like a pin, like like you said, like you have a pinhead sized ball here, then you have something the size of a cork behind it, and then
Right.
and then that that pinhead is like the shadow that you see, and then behind the pinhead is something the size of the sun, you know? It's just like You
Right,
have
right.
a
And
minus,
it's like the devil is the shadow cast by the pinhead.
yeah, onto the cork, onto the
Right.
corks.
No, I love that. That's great. And
It's like the devil is much bigger than us, much more powerful as necessarily was the case, right?
right, a great red drag, a great red dragon in comparison to us, but compared to God, it's this tiny pinhead.
Exactly. It's just like, oh, look at that. Look at that little thing right there. Which actually speaks to how amazing it is that he'd go out of his way for us the way he has, right? Um, that he would give his word multiple times to just about every single culture in the world in one form or another. It's what we've done with it that's made it into something else. Because if you do an analysis on the level of values espoused by all of the different religions, they all speak about love. They all look to love. And that was another thing that came up this week for me too.
And they all look
Um,
upward to the skies. They all look up to the vast.
up, up to the skies and at the concept, at the idea of love. And one of those things that really came to me this week, within my own spiritual framework, right? There's the highest, right? Who is unreachable. He is unformed. He is the unsubstantiate. Then you have the next level, which is kind of the formed beings, but they are still much, much further from us than we are. They're much further from us.
What do you mean by that? Like angels or
I would say even more powerful than your typical angel. Um, these are beings that were the first created ones, like the first ring around the Almighty, right? So to speak. And I wouldn't even say around because, it's formless. He is formless. But you have those first beings that came in that kind of formed anchors and anchored the various aspects of love, which is why
so
when it comes to angels, they tend to embody very specific strains within love, but they can never embody love itself fully, properly.
sometimes you lose me when talking about higher beings. So I want to maybe delve into that a little bit more and get a little bit of clarity because sometimes I get a little lost on what you mean
Mhm.
by beings of higher realms. Are these beings that are extraterrestrial or
Oh,
angelic,
so
or like or is it not or beings of pure consciousness? What are you getting at?
so hmm. The what I'm getting at is that there's a specific order to creation. Um, and the way, at least the way I view it, I'm trying my best. I'm still learning this, right? Because learning is never finished, but I'm learning to um, weigh and examine the structure that was given to us by Abdul Shin out of the Grill message. And what he has said, at least for me, I've kind of lined up with how things are um, show themselves to me at least. But when I say that beings of higher realms, there is a gradation, right? We are not strong enough. We are not powerful enough to be close to the presence of the Almighty. Nothing created or nothing that has form is close to Him in the first place.
I mean, what about Christ as the embodiment of God incarnate? I mean, like as coming as brother and divine.
Yeah. So that was a thing where the Lord traveled out of the unsubstantiate into the substantiate and cloaked. Basically, you know how we're talking about how there's an infinite spectrum of vibration.
Sure. What do you mean by like wavelength, or what do you mean?
Yeah, you could take it as wavelength, but it goes far in one direction and the other as well. Like there's the visible electromagnetic spectrum we have here, we have access to, but there's much more beyond it on the quicker side, and there's some beyond it on the slower side of things. Um, so when you then think about how high, how far that goes, right? That goes up to the very highest of everything that was formed. Um, when Christ came, he came out of the unsubstantiate. He came out of that which was not formed. So it's kind of like the unsubstantiate or that which is beyond vibration then becomes vibrational and adopts a kind of cloak, so to speak, so that it can interact with the creation, right? So what I'm getting at too is we're talking about how when we incarnate, when humans incarnate, right, we leave the visible spectrum and we go experience somewhere else on a higher frequency. Then we come back into that visible spectrum if there are more lessons to be learned. This is kind of like that, but on the highest end, right? The Almighty sees us and Lucifer and all of this stuff happening, and he realizes, okay, there needs to be a bit of surgery done on creation in this area, in that area, in this way, in that way. So he sends himself out of the unsubstantiate, comes into the into what exists, from the highest realm, and basically the same way we cloak ourselves with electromagnetic spectrum to experience on the earth is the same way he had cloaked himself and his consciousness in the various higher vibrations he needed to travel through in order to get down here into the electromagnetic spectrum that we experience and see and have access to. So what he did in order to send Christ was he sent a part of himself that went through each of these vibrations and became denser and denser so that we weren't, because um, we could never experience or access him in any way. He is too perfect for us to consciously perceive or be in his presence and be in the presence of him. It's like almost like you being in the presence of uranium. You know how uranium breaks down the human body when you're exposed to it just by sheer force of the vibration that comes out of it. It's a
Wait,
similar.
I still get a little, I still get lost. It still seems rather abstract to me. I still, I don't know that I really follow.
Okay.
Um,
Um,
well,
would you
maybe,
want me to would you want me to share my screen potentially?
uh, potentially, maybe not, maybe next, maybe if we talk again, I don't,
Okay, no problem.
um, yeah, why not? Yeah, throw it up there. Sure. Yeah, sure.
All right. So let me see what I can do. Hold on. And this does, I guess there's a little bit too much. I'm getting a little too into the weeds when it comes to the science part of it. But the electromagnetic spectrum um, represents a wavelength because everything is vibration at the end of the day. Everything is vibration. So if we think of it in these terms, let me open the image in a new tab. In a new tab. Um, let me open this one. Let me use this one actually. So sorry. That one's really poorly. Um, let's see. Uh, sorry, it's taking. All right. So you see what's going on here?
Mm,
So you have different frequencies that make up the universe, the visible, accessible, tangible universe. There necessarily it doesn't be these things don't aren't created or destroyed, right? This that the concept of neither being created nor destroyed implies that there are longer and slower wavelengths to the left of this spectrum, and that there are faster and higher frequencies to the right of this. That this is, even though this is what's visible and accessible to us as the electromagnetic spectrum, there are necessarily things that exist to the left of it and to the right of it. This is just all that we have access to as people that are on Earth right now, or people that are in the physical. What I'm getting at is this higher end continues all the way through the creations. It continues going in one form or another. That vibration gets faster and faster, more intense, until you get to the border of everything that's created, and you get to the point where the unsubstantiate begins, like that which is beyond that which is created. Um, and what I'm saying is the Lord, as being the height, being that which is beyond that which is created, right? Saw what was happening here, saw what Lucifer was doing as well, because this was kind of given to him as an area to govern. He's kind of like a governor, so to speak. And he saw that, okay, the governor is ruling this part of the land in a way that I don't like. So I'm going to go here and tell the citizens what's going on and why the governor is not to be followed. Why this is how the world should work. This is how we create harmonious societies and things like that. I know it's getting a little hard to follow, but if this were to continue, you'd get to the very highest vibrations of all that was created. Human beings, as human beings, only have access to the higher ends up to a certain point. Can only go so far right on this end of the spectrum. So the reason, so when I speak about Christ coming into the world, right? It's part of the unsubstantiate, then becoming vibrational, then taking on a form. And in order to get here into the physical, there's a large distance that has to be traveled through. And in order to protect us from from the overwhelming magnificence of who he is, so to speak, he had to cloak himself and protect himself in layers so that we don't become destroyed in his presence. And the equivalent of that was what I was talking about with the uranium, is when we're exposed to these rays, when our physical body is exposed to these rays. I don't know how much you know about biology, but when we're exposed to especially gamma rays, our cells break down. Like,
But I think I'd like to just pull it back down to earth a little bit. Um, because I'm really having a hard time following. And I was coming to mind this line in the Gospels of like the kingdom of heaven being like a net which gets dragged through the water and which gathers all the different fish
mhm.
in it and then is taken up out of the water and the fish are sorted of which ones to keep and which ones to give back. And I'm not trying to, it's something that I haven't, it's just not my normal thought pattern. And like this part of seeking God and like in this sort of, like the interaction of ideas, like ideas themselves of what what do we pursue, what do we not pursue,
Mhm.
what is invaluable, and like the yeah, like choose it, like and like the exploration of ideas. And also I was thinking about just sort of free speech of the important ability to be able to share and express ideas and get everything out there and really discuss these things. Just the ability to have these conversations and mull through ideas. Because I
Mhm.
think there's even a hesitancy to pursue these ideas, and it's everything's worth investigating and
Yeah.
looking into. That
And I'm of the belief that just about everything that's happened. So one oftentimes people think of logic and spirituality or logic and religion, science is religion as things that are completely separated from one another. And I'm of the complete opposite opinion that they are the same things and necessarily have to be the same things. Um, and I was just kind of, I guess this was my attempt at kind of portraying that, but I did so in a way that wasn't so easy to follow, which tells me I should work on that presentation. But the um, everything is necessarily valuable, at least for the personal that is, right? Um, the weighing and examining that we do while we're here necessarily has to be of some value. Um, some of it may not be understood in the moment, but it goes back to kind of the axiom that I say oftentimes that everything is sacred. How you deal with the ideas, how you use them and implement them in your lives, have speak for themselves. They speak to the spirit that is, or the consciousness that is incarnated through your current present physical being. Um,
and it's one of the reasons why I don't love conversations about theology so much, and one of the reasons why Zen has appealed to me so greatly, as opposed to say Hinduism or the Buddhism of India. I mean, like for me, what the appeal of like the Chinese Taoists and the Zen Buddhists was the absolute practicality of the faith and the lack, like almost the complete lack of theology.
hmm,
Um, and what attracted me to Christ was just the clarity of, and all it was similar in the simplicity, like Christ in his simplicity. Paul talking about, I wish that you would not be distracted by or I would have the simplicity that is in Christ. And I mean, it's that philosophical debating once again, where like coming down to earth and really feeling these things in the heart, the love in the heart, and practicing these principles. And I think that's where the connection comes in between people. I think that's like, say, the unifying, bonding force of people if we want to have really a unified world where we also are able to explore those ideas, whether theological, scientific, philosophical, the ability to really flush out those ideas and follow them to the end, and that the safety net, the unifying thing that stops us each from spinning off into our own worlds, is that love, is that unifying connection of, and the desire for seeking genuine truth, coming together in a spirit of genuine seeking. And that's why I think my conversations with you are often so fruitful, and I enjoy talking with you. It's this genuine seeking after truth at its core, and unified in a spirit of love, where we don't have to agree or completely understand each other's philosophy, but come together in that spirit um, of really like really looking for truth and letting what is most important stay. And it's that questioning that idea of not being absolutely set and that we're in this exploration.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. And everything starts with lack of knowledge. That's the reason why I feel like we're able to exchange because where knowledge is kind of thrown out the window, it leaves room for things to be changed. It leaves room for the world to be shown to each other, just for us to see the world through different sets of eyes. Um, yeah, and the more one does that, the more points of evidence going back to that line on a plane, the more points we get to see that points towards that the line points towards something. It's very interesting.
And and love, truth, beauty, all various descriptions for the Almighty that we're both getting at that same
Mm,
highest or divinity in its highest manifestation. And I think that's one of the real shared things across mankind, across cultures, across everything is this um, desire for that.
everything better points to love. Every step, every next step that is an improvement points to love. And it's the fact that he is love too points to it's like the maypole thing again, the maypole example.
Or this is being recorded, and so for the people, it's something that I thought was very brilliant. But for people listening, the maypole, dive into it.
Well, one of the ways I view religions and beliefs, and actually just people in general, no matter where you are, no matter what beliefs you hold, is that at the center of everything is the Almighty, which is equivalent to the value of love. And everything has a link to that center pole from which everything started. And each of our connections to that center may differ in its quality and the types of things that go on. If you don't mind me sharing my screen one more time.
Go for it. You want to pull up the maypole?
Yeah. Uh,
I'm interested to see how the screen sharing is going to come up in the recording.
um, yeah. Can you see this?
I can, yes.
Okay. So as you can see how it works, each of these have different colors to them. But the analogy even goes even further, right? That center pole is love. We're all connected towards love, directed towards love, and connected with it in one way
Almighty,
or another. Hmm?
the first principle. Right.
Yeah, exactly. But what differs and what makes us different is the nature of the connection to that love. And this is actually relatively simplistic compared to the analogy that I used, but the analogy then goes on to say that our connections have different lengths and the material from which we're connected to the maypole also differs. Some people have longer ropes than others that are connected to the center of the maypole. Others have shorter ropes. Others have ropes that are made out of material like paper. Others have material that are made of iron chains. Some people have it made out of gold. Some people have a bejeweled one. Some people don't, so on and so forth. And that goes for every single human being. So you can imagine billions and billions and billions of connections to this center that we call love. Um,
Or this, or I may interject also the self. It's called the true self,
mhm.
the real I, not the ego, but the self.
And you have those like atheists which who have a connection necessarily, but have decided to just let it be on the ground, or people who take religion a little too dogmatically and like for at face value without further investigation. Those type of people I would describe as being obsessed with the rope itself and not concerned with the center that connects everybody. Um, and you have varying traditions and things of that nature that then dictate what that connection is made out of, how long it is, and whether or not it's being held with joy or held with suffering, or it goes as you think about it, it goes deeper and deeper. But that's the general gist of that analogy.
Yeah. No, I remember when you told me that, and I thought it was very brilliant.
Mm,
Yeah, it definitely stuck with me.
mm.
Well, what do you think about ending the recording, today's recording with the maypole?
Sounds good.
Okay. I'm just gonna pause the or stop the recording.